Egypt. Food price increase since 2021, 20 to 30%. Current inflation rates, over 12%. Food reserves, enough to last only 6 months. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, Egypt's food prices have become unbearably expensive. 80% of the country's wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine, and so does a lot of its cooking oil. For a country whose people rely heavily on bread as a staple food, having only 4 months of wheat reserves left, with no promises of being able to import more, is playing with fate to say the least. And with the average salary in Egypt just around $500 a month, major price increases like these are setting the country up for a crisis. Tunisia. Food price increase since 2021, 34%. Current inflation rate, 7%. Food reserves, none, 0. Across Tunisia, shops are running out of food to sell to angry customers. Subsidized flour, oil, and rice have all run out. Nearly half of Tunisia's wheat imports came from Ukraine, and with the war in full swing and farming at a halt, Tunisia's leaders fear the food shortages will spark another Arab Spring, which was a series of anti-government protests, uprisings, and armed rebellions across much of the Arab world in the early 2010s. Pakistan. Food price increase since 2021, over 30%. Current inflation rates, 13%. Food reserves, unknown. The government refuses to make the numbers public. First it was the locust swarms, then COVID-19 stopped trade, and now the war in Ukraine is the last nail in Pakistan's food insecurity coffin. With wheat forming at least 60% of the average Pakistani's diet, a drop in imports or food reserves could bring the country to its knees. Ethiopia. Food price increase since 2021, over 150%. Current inflation rates, over 33%. Food reserves, none. Ethiopia has never had a steady food supply. Major parts of Ethiopia have always been on the edge of famine, and the war in Ukraine is not doing anything to promote stability. With a drought drying up almost all of the country's domestic farming, Ethiopia has no choice but to rely on imports to keep its people alive. But unfortunately in 2022, prices may be just too high for people to afford. All around the world, food prices are skyrocketing. Flour, wheat, rice, and oil, the food some of the poorest countries in the world rely on to survive, have become scarce, unaffordable. The global food price index is at the highest it's ever been, and everyone is feeling the crunch. And for good reason. Ukraine was the world's 6th largest exporter of wheat in the world, with a 10% share of the market. But the key word there is was. You see, food prices have gone up so high that analysts believe we're on the brink of the next global food crisis. Luckily for countries like the US, we have an easy 30 to 40% of our annual calories sitting in reserves waiting to be used in an emergency. If Ukraine suddenly stops exporting wheat like it did, we could all still survive for at least another 5 months without triggering mass chaos. Other countries like Ethiopia and Tunisia don't have that luxury. Most of these countries rely on importing food on loans to keep their people alive. And with Ukraine just being a little too busy trying not to be destroyed to be worried about this year's harvest, it's leaving a lot of opportunity for mass starvation or for someone to step in to save all these poor countries from famine. And because America only has 5 months of reserves for just Americans, it's not going to be America that saves the day. Turns out, there's one country that has been stocking up food reserves for years, and this country is in the perfect position to use those food reserves as a geopolitical tool, a negotiation tool of sorts, to dangle food in the faces of starving populations so they comply with this country's every beck and call. And that country is China. One of the simplest ways to save money is by canceling subscriptions you no longer need. But if you're like me, you literally have too many subscriptions to keep track of. That is where Truebill comes in. Truebill is an all-in-one personal finance app that I love using. And one of my favorite features is their subscription tracker. You just link up your bank account, and Truebill will then analyze and list out all the subscriptions you have and how much they're costing you. You can even cancel the ones you don't need right inside Truebill without ever leaving the app. It has saved me a ton of time and money. Truebill has saved their over 2 million users more than $100 million and counting. And another one of my favorite features is that they'll negotiate to lower your bills for you. You select the bill you want to lower, enter some information about yourself like your address, and that's it. Truebill can negotiate your bill down on your behalf. Truebill has an 85% success rate in lowering bills. If they're successful, you get to choose how much of those savings you pay to Truebill for their service. I usually choose 50% of whatever they save me. Truebill is loaded with so many other valuable features that I'm proud to promote. And all you have to do to get started is pause the video and go to truebill.com/Jake with the link below. That's truebill.com/Jake with the link below so they know I sent you. Thanks to Truebill for sponsoring this video. Ukraine and Russia are some of the world's biggest food exporters. Together, they're responsible for nearly a third of the world's wheat, from which things like flour is made. And they're also responsible for almost 20% of the world's corn production and over half of the world's sunflower oil. In total, 12% of the world's calories comes from Ukraine or Russia. But that's where the biggest problem comes in. You see, countries like the US and Canada are pretty self-sufficient when it comes to food production. We all have our own corn and wheat farms, so we don't really need to import stuff from Ukraine or Russia. And Europe? Well, most European countries are wealthy enough to manage an increase in food prices. For most of us, a loaf of bread going from $2 to $2.40 isn't really a big deal. But for countries like Ethiopia, where most people are only earning $35 to $40 a month, a 20 to 30% price increase is a nightmare. And most of Ukraine's and Russia's food exports used to go to regions like these in the Middle East and Africa. These countries' governments would make deals with Russia and Ukraine to subsidize food or take loans out to keep their people fed. It wasn't an ideal situation, but at least they weren't starving. But then the war came along. And suddenly, all of that flew out the window. Russia invades Ukraine, the world sanctions Russia, and all that wheat and corn they were exporting before, yeah, that stuff is not going anywhere anymore. But here's the real kicker. Russia is also a major exporter of fertilizer, so even if countries wanted to avoid starvation by planting their own food, there's now a shortage of fertilizer too, leading to fertilizer also skyrocketing in price. One farmer in Kenya has pretty much given up on farming entirely. For years, she had been growing vegetables to keep her family alive and to make money on the side. But now with all the sanctions blocking Russia from exporting fertilizer, it would cost 5 times more to fertilize her entire farm than before. Even if she could find fertilizer to buy, she would be losing money instead of making it. In this sense, Russian sanctions have backfired dramatically. Now let's talk about Ukraine.
This is the time for farmers to be out there planting corn.
Right now.
Right now. This is their time. And they're not. Why? Because farmers are soldiers.
First, it's kind of hard to focus on keeping farmers happy with their jobs when your country is at war. So obviously, food production in Ukraine isn't anywhere near where it was before the war.
Do you think that people understand how important Ukraine is for feeding the world?
Now they do understand, he says. They may not have before, but now they get it.
The same thing goes for exports. Since most of Ukraine's food is shipped through the Black Sea, which currently is a conflict zone, most of the ships are stuck at port with nowhere to go.
Odessa's port is closed, which has cut off one of the world's largest exporters of food. Ukraine, the size of Texas, is number 4 in corn and wheat, number 1 in sunflower oil. David Beasley told us half the wheat the World Food Program needs worldwide is stuck in Ukraine.
And things aren't getting better anytime soon. Almost every country around the world is worried about running out of food. Even with half a year's reserves, there's no guarantee that the war won't go on much longer than that, leaving millions of people at risk of starvation. Even in America, food prices are going up. All around the world, countries are trying to hoard food for themselves. But in all this chaos and fear, one country has seen an opportunity like never before. A chance to expand its reach, power, and influence. A chance to take control of governments and nations while pretending it's only there to help. That country? None other than China.
China is a complete outlier. For years, China has been stockpiling food. And at this point, China has 150% of their annual consumption of food in storage.
While everyone else was occupied with the crisis of the day, China had been secretly creating massive stockpiles of food for years. Right now, if the world stopped producing any food, China could survive for 1.5 years on the food they have in storage. And yet, the US only has enough reserves for not even half of a year, with a population 4 times smaller than China. And when the war in Ukraine hits, China didn't slow down its food collection. They bought up half of the world's grains like wheat, which means they're also responsible for pushing up food prices for everyone else. That means China is in the perfect position for some food diplomacy. For years, the global power dynamic has maintained a very sensitive balance between the world's superpowers. Every chance they got, China, Russia, and America would try to tip the balance in their favor, and the war in Ukraine was no exception. You see, for decades, many African, South American, and South Asian countries have struggled to keep their people fed, educated, and healthy without outside help. Most of these countries are rich in natural resources, like gold, oil, and other metals, but they don't really have the money or infrastructure to mine or process any of these resources. So they agreed to trade with countries like Russia, China, and the US. You give us money, food security, and medical equipment, and your companies get to come in and mine for gold or oil. Or maybe even choose our next president if you're lucky. But here's the problem. America has almost always had the upper hand when it comes to these trades. No matter how much money China and Russia throw at these countries, America's influence has always had the upper hand until it comes to food. You see, without food, these African, Asian, and South American countries are at risk of chaos. Everyone knows what happens when people can't buy food or it's too expensive to afford. So when the time inevitably comes, China will probably come in and offer them something no other country can: food. America only has enough food reserves to keep itself going, but China has enough to use as leverage against all the countries it's interested in. The deal? You let us take your natural resources, you let us influence your government, you be pro-China and anti-West, and in exchange, we'll give you all the food you need. No protests, no revolutions over the people not having enough to eat. You get to keep your money, your power, your position, and we get to suck your country dry. Thanks to the war in Ukraine, China has been given the opportunity of a lifetime to shift the balance of power in some of the most resource-rich countries in the world. What's up guys, hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you're new here, my name is Jake and we make documentaries just like this one every single week on money, power, and crime multiple times a week for free. So if you enjoyed this one, make sure to click that subscribe button, and if you want longer ones that are too controversial to post publicly, click that join button below. I'm actually working on one right now that is definitely going to get demonetized if I post it publicly, so you're not going to want to miss it. And if you join and you don't think it's worth it, there's a refund policy, so you can just email me and I will refund you the money. You can follow me on Instagram at jtran.io. That's going to wrap it up. Thank you so much for watching. Stay dangerous out there, and I will see you guys in the next one.